All right. Hello and welcome from the apocalypse in Texas. Thanks for joining the third Thursday community meeting for Pinniped. We got some really exciting topics to cover today. Just a reminder, please adhere to the code of conduct when attending these meetings. And from now on, I'm gonna let Matt, I'm assuming you're gonna take over.
Yeah, I can take over.
You're the best driver.
I'm happy to. Cool. We'll go through status updates first, and then there's actually a long list of discussion topics. I kind of don't expect us to get through most of them, so they'll be relevant next time. So we'll just save them for next time if we don't have time today. First up is Andrew.
Mostly just working on the concierge impersonation, or helping work on the concierge impersonation proxy implementation. I'm sure we'll hit more on status there, but that's mostly my update.
Cool. Ryan.
Yeah, similar, working with Mario and Andrew on the impersonation proxy and working with Mo and the rest of the team on our LDAP planning.
Mo.
Yeah, so Ryan and I did a lot of LDAP work this week, and I think the main thing I worked on in between the last meeting and this one is the changes to the concierge APIs, just sort of some cleanup there.
Margot, I think your update was sort of covered by.
Yeah, it's kind of same as Andrew. I am working on the impersonation proxy.
Cool. I think we talked in the last meeting here about what that was and why we were doing it. So I don't think we need to go into much. My update, I have just some small items. Dependabot is working again. So there's like a bunch of PRs. Like it opened a bunch of PRs yesterday to bump depths, and then this morning it closed them all and reopened new ones because the depths changed again. I think this is really cool. Doesn't quite work yet because the CLA bot is still telling it like it needs the GitHub needs to sign our CLA, which is not true. I escalated that internally with the person who works on it. That project for the CLA bot though seems, yeah, anyway, we can talk about that offline. I've been working on docs this week on our website. You might notice this very mind-blowing change on our website where now the fonts are bigger. that was literally one of the changes I made yesterday, was bigger fonts, more contrast. But then now mostly I've been working on the content in our docs and kind of reorganizing it. I wanted to call out that we hit 100 GitHub stars yesterday. I think this is not working right now. Oh, it is working. Pretty cool. This was when we launched the project. There's a big spike there. And like, I don't know, people are coming across the project. It's kind of cool to see. Yeah, Pablo.
Yeah, I guess just the bullets are pretty self-explanatory. We've been doing a lot of planning and scoping work this week and last, and I've been catching back up on the architecture because I was out so long. I was like, how does this stuff work again? I need to look at this. So Matt helped me out a little bit with that. And also thinking through a longer term but iterative roadmap to share it with the open source community. I think the only thing that I'm trying to think through a little bit more on this is, there's a bit of a balance between the VMware side of the house and what's relevant to the open source community. So thinking about how we put stuff forward to the open source community and keep our main backer happy as well. So that's all.
Cool. I think we'll dive into discussion topics now. So we did kick off a little bit of discussion yesterday about the LDAP identity provider, but Andrew was out and it wasn't in the community meeting. So I think, I don't know, Mo and Ryan, do you think you can introduce that a little bit? Maybe we can kick off that, rejoin that discussion basically. about what we want to do about LDAP.
I was going to ask, do we want to start off with like our motivation, right? Not necessarily anything about design or even any open questions about the design, but like why we're even trying to solve this. I can give my like little spiel, and maybe Ryan has slightly different thoughts, or others have different thoughts. But in general, I think what we want is Pinniped to be useful in a broad set of environments. The impersonation proxy is, one of those attempts to make it available in a lot of Kubernetes environments where we don't work today. Sort of the flip side of that is where your identity lives might not be an OIDC provider, and we want to cover that side as well, right? So if you can run Pinniped successfully on a variety of Kubernetes environments, and you can configure Pinniped to honor your identity from a variety of sources, we cover both of those edges as best as we can, we're much more likely to be broadly useful. So we felt that OIDC was the greatest place to start. Like that is sort of like a great protocol for like sort of getting you a really big footprint on what providers you support. But the reality is not everyone uses it. And so like a very common deployment is LDAP or Active Directory or FreeIPA or Open LDAP or a variety of different flavors. It's a very traditional identity provider. It's been deployed for a long time. So we thought that one would be a good one to support. I suspect over time we will support more. And it would be great if the order that we go in was sort of based on feedback from just like, wouldn't it be cool if you supported GitHub? Like, just a little bit of a community-driven focus there would be really nice, personally for me. So anyone have else things to add about our thoughts?
From a product lens, that's exactly right. Utility and adoption was the main driver behind this decision. So well articulated, Mo.
Yeah, and I think the other tie-in with our project goals and scope is that we also want to push people towards the most secure defaults. And so that's a little bit at odds with LDAP support, because actually, if you have a choice between OIDC and LDAP, you should be using OIDC. So I think the other maybe motivator here is that there are just a lot of LDAP installations that are out there that don't have OIDC support. And we want to target those environments.
Yeah, you should not expose your LDAP to the public internet. I would not be too stressed out if you expose the supervisor to the public internet, because it's supposed to be safe in that environment.
Cool. Okay, so yesterday we, does Ryan or Mo, do you want to share that doc from yesterday and we can go through it some more, or is that a good place? Is that where we want to restart, or is there a different place? I think yesterday we got through a good chunk of the doc, and the section that we left off on was we had a few details to talk about, and then we were going to talk about maybe some user stories and roughly prioritized order.
Do we want to do that now? I know there was an internal team meeting on the calendar already for that. I'm not sure how we want.
Yeah, if you want to. So Mo brought this up this morning. It's like, I'm happy to defer to that meeting if we want to. We have other discussion topics. Do folks want to talk about it now, or do we want to move on to other topics right now?
I guess a quick Roman vote.
I was going to say, from my thought, from a community perspective, what I was more trying to hope to sort of make clear to anyone is like, what are our open questions, and if anyone has got an opinion on them. Like, I think a lot of them we don't necessarily like know like what choice is the best. We just have a guess or an educated sort of an idea, And if anyone has experience in LDAP in a particular way, and you're like, oh, like, don't forget to do this or that, that would be cool. But yeah, I don't necessarily feel like we should certainly link the doc so that way people can find it and they can make comments on it. But it is like, it's kind of like a in the weeds doc, right? Like Ryan and I spent like a lot of time like basically going through enough different variations to basically pull up like not implementation details per se, but like important questions to answer and agree upon, so that way whatever we build is like sustainable and useful for a lot of end users and secure, that type of stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. I linked to the doc if folks are interested in reading that. It was all public. Okay, moving down the list. I had a bunch of topics here. The first one was to spur a little bit of discussion about multiple IDP support, which we kind of got into yesterday. We decided it was out of scope for LDAP, the LDAP feature. Wanted to just bring this topic up. I think this is going to be relevant pretty soon. My thought is there's a couple of things that we want to do, and I think they're all pretty small. One would be have some sort of wiring between the federation domain and the identity provider CRDs, probably like a label selector, and probably a label selector on the federation domain pointing at the IDPs would be my sort of straw dog proposal. That feels pretty easy to build. The other thing we might want to do then is add some sort of additional authorized parameter that selects an IDP. So that would be during the CLI login flow, assuming that there are multiple IDPs and that the CLI already knows which one it wants to use, it should be able to express that in the original authorized request. And that should be then one of the kind of authorized parameters that we track, and then that lets us trigger the right backend IDP login. And then I think maybe there's a third one that's not that important now, which would be a discovery API, so that if you don't know which IDP you want to use, you can list the available IDPs along with maybe like some properties about each one. So you kind of can choose, you can set a priority on the client about which one you want to use. Those three items. So a way to wire together multiple IDPs and multiple federation domains, a parameter to select one, and maybe a discovery sort of advertising mechanism. Is that roughly what other folks had in mind? Or is there something else that I missed? I'm going to take some notes here while we go.
Just as an initial thought, I think a label selector makes me nervous, mostly because it's dynamic. I don't know if that actually makes sense for what the properties we would want are. Right? If you're putting the label selector on the federation domain, you're saying the federation domain picks which identity providers belong to it, right? But that would, to me, imply that if you create a new identity provider, you should not be able to coerce a federation domain to consume it, right? By putting in a label selector that matches that federation domain.
Maybe I would say my sort of like threat model for this is that the permissions of managing federation domains and managing IDPs are always belong to the same set of people. So you never have permission to change one and not change the other. It's not useful to assign permissions that way.
Okay.
In that model, it's not so much like about so we're not necessarily trying to design these APIs so that they can express any other more complicated threat model. We're just trying to make it so that the configurations that you'd want to use in most production environments are easy to manage. So in other words, like I might have a set of IDPs that are for developers, and I could call those like developer IDPs and set a label on them. And maybe have another set of IDPs that I know is like some contractor team uses. And then I can define a federation domain.
Just to clarify, when you say IDPs, you mean upstream external IDPs?
Yeah, I mean like identity provider CRD instances. So we have the OIDC one, we're adding the LDAP one. If we add more, they would all have, I could label those. So I could say like, okay, my OIDC provider, and maybe get some future GitHub provider. Those are like developer IDPs. I've got some like contractor, and they have like contracting firm X IDP, and I label it specially. And then I could split up my federation domains, and I could have a federation domain for dev clusters where I give access to like everything, and then another federation domain for staging prod clusters or something where I exclude the contractors, something like that. I don't know. I'm just trying to think about what kind of relationships and configurations might be useful in practice, and how we can express them in like the simplest way. So like another proposal would be, don't use label selectors, use an explicit list of object references in each federation domain. And I feel like that would be cumbersome, maybe.
So I had thought the most simplest design would be an identity provider itself in its spec says which federation domain it belongs to, and it can only belong to one.
So I think that the mental model I had that breaks down there is if I have separate federation domains for like dev and prod, oftentimes I would want to have them both use the same set of IDPs. Yep. So I want them to be like separated for some other reasons. Maybe I have different token lifetimes or something like that downstream. But actually, it's the same pool of users logging into both of them. I don't want to have to like define my IDP twice and have to go register two clients. Although actually, you have to register two clients anyway right now, because the callback URI is nested under the federation domain URL, right?
So like the reason I would say that is I think you want them to actually be separate IDPs. Like I think you actually want to define them twice. I don't think it's actually burdensome because you might do this once or twice. I just think the label selector, I think, is very Kubernetes-like, but it's incredibly flexible. And I don't actually know if you want that level of flexibility. That's the concern there, is like yes, you could reuse IDPs. Maybe you don't want to, right? Like maybe that's actually not the desired intent, that here's my bucket of IDPs for this federation domain. Here's my bucket of IDs for that one. If I had to copy paste one YAML, like once you do it once, you don't have to keep doing it, right? Like not really. Like how often do you expect someone to make a new federation domain and make a new IDP? Like it tends to be like almost static config once it's done.
If it was, Matt, you suggested maybe it could also be object references. That would work just as well to allow you to avoid copying and pasting your config around. You were asking if you would have to find another OAuth client. I don't think you would, right? Because one OAuth client can have lots of different allowed redirect endpoints.
That's true. I wonder if that, yeah, and that makes sense, because the only kind of ingress that we have to the supervisor is through the URLs defined, endpoints defined in the federation domains. We could have actually separated that. I guess we didn't. I don't think we even really considered it. We could have had on the IDP, on the OIDC identity provider CRD, another place to specify an HTTPS endpoint that serves as the callback that's like independent of the federation domain. So you could actually have like a federation domain hosted under some URL, another one hosted under some URL, and then a totally separate URL where you receive callbacks from some client. And we would actually have to do that, I think, if we wanted to make one OIDC identity provider. Well, like I said, you could register multiple redirect URIs, but if you didn't want to reconfigure your provider each time you added a new federation domain, we'd have to factor out the callback URL from the federation domains. And maybe that sounds like a little bit complicated and confusing to have to define that separately, but if we do want to think about like Pinniped supervisor as an abstraction layer that has a bunch of IDPs on the back end and then has federation domains on the front end, it would be nice if they were kind of like totally separate API surfaces, I guess, so that you can, the behavior of the OIDC identity provider doesn't really depend on how you're using it, configuring the downstream surface. It's only configured by the OIDC identity provider CRD. I think I'm going down like a kind of a different proposal now, but I do worry, like, for me, like maybe the first question to answer is, okay, if we have many, right now we have a single federation domain and a single IDP. When we support multiple of each of them, what is the relation between them? Is it many to many? Is it like many to one? Is it one to many? Which of those things makes sense? I think what Mo is saying is that it should be one to many. So each federation domain might have several IDPs backing it, but each IDP only ever belongs to a single federation domain.
Mm-hmm.
I think my initial thought was it was like many to many. Maybe this matters too. Like if we do have like an object reference or a label selector, if it's many to one, like you're saying, Mo, then actually the label selector would go on sorry, not the label selector. The object reference would go on the IDP CRD. It would select a single federation domain that it's attached to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, unless you wanted a list on the federation domain, that would also work, which I don't actually have a strong opinion on which direction that would be. I just thought it made more, I just thought it would be simpler and easier to understand what you had actually configured if the configuration was a little bit more static. And then you did not have to worry about what exactly does it mean if IDPs are being reused across federation domains.
One thing that might be kind of cool about the label selector, although it is more dynamic and maybe it takes a little more thought for a user to understand, in that example that Matt was giving, where maybe you have some staging, some prod, some other systems, and you make different federation domains. You could imagine creating several IDPs and then putting labels on them, like this is a production IDP, this is a staging IDP. And some of those IDPs might even have multiple labels, like this IDP is both production and staging. That has kind of cool properties in terms of helping you organize things and making it clear, like why you're setting it up, not just the way that you're setting it up. Different options worth thinking more about.
I guess I had thought in my head that you would just define the federation domain, call it prod. And if it was all in the federation domain, you just list the name of IDPs, right? And by definition, you know that. In that world, you could theoretically still do the many to many. You could actually reuse still if the pointers were going from the federation domain out, because technically two federation domains could still select. But yeah, but if you looked at the identity, if we put it on the identity provider and it was a single item, it would literally be, okay, I see this identity provider and the federation domain's name is prod. Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. This is a prod IDP. That's all it can ever be.
The other use case that might be, I think actually it is almost a simpler use case, is the multi-tenant use case of, I'm a managed services provider, I've got Pinniped supervisor, and I've got a customer Coke and a customer Pepsi, and I just want to keep them totally separate. And so you could do that today. One way you could do that is with separate namespaces. I feel like that would still be the right way to do that. Even if we add support for like multiple IDPs and multiple federation domains and wiring them together, the right thing to do in that case might still be to run 2 copies of the supervisor, separate namespaces, each of them, then that scenario would work today with without additional work from us. Does that match people's expectations?
Yeah, so it depends on the level of isolation you're trying to guarantee and like sort of the cost you're willing to have for that isolation, right? Because there is a cost of running many different processes, possibly with their own life cycles, so how they're managed. And maybe that's exactly what you want. Maybe you want to upgrade Pepsi's supervisor on a particular Saturday because they told you it was okay if you did it between some particular hours. Even if it had no downtime, they would prefer you do it, and it really didn't matter. So yeah, if you wanted that super strict isolation, and technically you could take it one level further and actually give them a different API group, and then and a different namespace. So then they're like complete islands. Then they don't share anything. That would be like the ultimate version of that. I'm not saying you really should do that. That's like the
If you really want isolation, you should really put them in different clusters, right?
you should
Different namespaces.
Because
you're always trading off isolation and resource efficiency. Like different, you might as well say you need to be in different data centers, different air gap data centers. That's like very secure. But yeah. So I think we talked about 2 use cases for multiple. So I think we kind of all understand why you might want multiple IDPs, because you might be transitioning from one to the other. You might have like an IDP that's complicated and has poor uptime, and another IDP that's really simple but is like always online. Or you might have IDPs for different pools of users. That seems more clear to me. I don't think we've necessarily talked about why you might want multiple federation domains.
I was going to make one comment on one of the common patterns I saw for multiple IDPs is the IDPs would actually be backed by the exact same user data. It's just that the IDPs themselves had different levels of functionality. So I often saw like OIDC and like Active Directory used together. So the OIDC flows were reserved for browser-based interactions, and the Active Directory Kerberos style flows were reserved for CLI-based interactions. So it was basically like, I want SSO everywhere. I want a different SSO flow for the CLI, and I want a different SSO flow for the browser. I want to basically have the best of all worlds. And it was just easier for some customers to just specify the same IDP effectively in 2 different types. And that was pretty nice.
I think so. The 3 things I think we've talked about kind of already here. One is the multiple tenants case. You want to isolate. You want 2 different tenants to have different OIDC issuers, because you basically want them to be more isolated from each other. And you don't, especially that's important in Pinniped, because we don't do anything to validate audience values. And so if you have Coke and they're free to choose whatever audiences they want for their clusters, you have Pepsi and they're free to choose whatever audiences they want for their clusters, then if they happen to choose the same value, and they have the same issuer, that's bad, right? So we're using the issuer to separate that. I think we also talked about dev prod isolation, which is basically similar. I think it keeps you from having to coordinate things in one environment with things in another environment, and still have safety properties. I think another thing we talked about is like you might have, maybe in the dev prod case, or maybe for some other reasons, you might have different clusters that actually want different configuration parameters for things like token lifetimes, or I guess the other thing here is like different sets of valid IDPs. I think that's like the core thing. You might have dev clusters where you allow maybe login from GitHub, and prod clusters where you only allow login through corporate SAML or whatever. And those are separate, partly for what Mo said, which is that like they have different capabilities. Maybe the GitHub flow lets you log in really smoothly, and like you log in once a day and you have pretty long token lifetimes, and you can have refresh operations, and that all works great. SAML provides like maybe more security because it's backed through some enterprise thing that you have more visibility into, but doesn't support refresh, is less convenient. And so you might want to make two separate federation domains because you're willing to accept one set of trade-offs on one set of clusters and a different set of trade-offs on another set of clusters, right? Okay.
Maybe worth, I think we all understand this, but for anyone watching the video, it's maybe worth just stating like the basic concept of a federation domain, right? Is that it's a group of clusters. And anyone who can authenticate into the federation domain can authenticate into all of those clusters equally. So in your Coke versus Pepsi example, very important that the Coke employees and the Pepsi employees are not in the same federation domain.
So a related question I had to that is, so I know we don't support it today, but what are folks' thoughts on an enhancement to federation domain for it to become more opinionated on what audiences it will support, basically? So basically have the STS endpoint have like, it could, it could be super strict. You could say, if you ask for a cluster that I don't know about, I just reject. Or it could be like, if you ask for a cluster that I do know about, then it better have this audience, otherwise I reject, right? Or it could be what is
I think we had, when we designed it, we had thought that it would make sense to add a kind of allow list, like you're describing, where the federation domain will only respect or only give out STS tokens for a specific allowed list of audiences. But as soon as you do that, that means you need some other process to manage that allowed list as clusters are getting created and destroyed and added and whatever. So we haven't got around to doing it yet, but yeah, I think that would be a nice feature for some use cases.
I think we are on consensus on this that like that yes. Spell consensus. Yes. It could be a static allow list that where you have to basically then maybe usually have some controller managing it, or we could also support like a regex or some other things if we wanted to add some level of validation. But I think a static list of allowed audience values in our API, and we'll check that if it's there, is like a reasonable first take. And then I think we talked also about writing a plugin to Pinniped. Our first kind of like Pinniped add-on would be a controller that populates that list based on cluster API data, because that would be something we could basically build a little controller that watches the one API and echoes this field into Pinniped.
I was going to say, when you were trying to write out consensus and having a hard time spelling it, the next time we make a new component, please make it a word I can spell, because I have yet to successfully spell the word concierge correctly on the first try. So just as a personal gripe, that word is just so hard for me to spell, and I always get it wrong. And I think, to be fair, the current model that the federation domain has is similar to like what Walt has, which is the idea that like the thing that gave you the kubeconfig that made it so that you requested a particular audience is trusted. So like you are generally safe, right? Basically, don't get kubeconfigs from places you don't trust. Because remember that it can exec an arbitrary process as your user when you call the kubectl binary, and it could then go read your home directory and copy all your keys to $bad place. So you have to trust that. And so as long as you're getting it from a trusted place, you're totally safe. It's just that we would want to make it extra safe and in like a very explicit configuration that the supervisor is also aware of to make it.
And that's also combined with another property, which is the parameter that we're restricting here. You're still always authenticated as a user first,
Mhm.
and you're only ever getting back a token that's still authenticating you as a user. So it's only ever to your detriment to maliciously ask for a wrong audience. So as long as, if the malicious user is the authenticating user, there's kind of not a problem. And if the malicious user is feeding you a kube config, you shouldn't be accepting kube configs from a malicious source. And if you do, you've got bigger problems. It's a little subtle. Okay, I feel like this was a good discussion, but we kind of, I think we kind of petered out. So I think we could move on if folks are happy. And we have just a few minutes left. This is another, this is maybe a little more contentious topic. I'm looking at local user authenticator and thinking that it was very useful to, it's very useful when we only had the concierge, and it's very useful still to test webhook support. But that's, I was looking at our documentation that kind of tells you how to use it. And I was thinking it's not a great, maybe it's not the best tutorial kind of component. I wonder if we could replace it with something even more bare bones that's useful for testing, and maybe add proper local user support through a CRD that's either, I think maybe two different implementations. One that's in the concierge, so the concierge can accept a sort of a static token as a valid username, and you configure that with a local concierge user CRD. And then maybe also something on the supervisor that's basically the same, but across a whole federation domain, then to say if my IDP is dead. So the use cases for this would be I'm demoing Pinniped. That's one. Or I'm demoing a cluster that uses Pinniped. Also, the use case where my LDAP server is down, and so I can't log in, but I have this local user just in case. So I could do admin things while my IDP is down. And maybe that is better than having to fall back to long-lived admin client certificates in that case, which is what the alternative is today.
So I'm totally down with enhancing the supervisor. I am not so sure about the concierge, mostly because in my mental model, the concierge is not trusted by the user, right? Because the concierge isn't the IDP normally. So giving the concierge as a silly example, if the concierge had an IDP on it that supported username and password or something, and you gave it your password, to me that's a violation of what the concierge is supposed to do.
I would say we should not even call them passwords. We should call them bearer tokens, and then always generate them randomly. So you're never, and it would be then a token that's specific to that cluster would be the idea. I don't know. Another thought I did have here is another way we could get local user support today is to add a CLI command that generates a JOT signing key, saves it locally, outputs the JOT authenticator that, so we'd have to add support for specifying the signing keys inline in the CRD. Basically use our JOT signing support and say, hey, here's a JOT authenticator that's not pointing at a supervisor. It's not pointing at an OIDC server at all. It's just telling you that tokens signed by this key that's on my laptop are valid, and basically make that whole flow work nicely. That would also mean if I wanted to, I could probably in the future make that CLI command, put that signing key in TPM or something. I don't know if that's might be confusing then to basically, we basically be reusing the JOT authenticator to also provide local login functionality. But it seems like it would work pretty well for demo cases.
I think I might advocate based on past experience. As you know, but stating for people watching the video, I used to work on UAA, and UAA is both an identity provider and a proxy to identity providers. And because it tried to do both things, it the code base got bigger and bigger and bigger over time until it was unmanageable. So I think I might try to advocate for not ever having any identities stored anywhere in our supervisor or concierge. But because we can already reach out to identity providers, we could provide an identity provider, either a webhook identity provider, which is what the local user authenticator is, or an LDAP identity provider, like we could package up Open LDAP, or something else that can provide that source of static users. So from our point of view, it's just another upstream, although it might be an upstream that's packaged into the same deployment.
I can see how that is. I can see where you're coming from. I think that like any solution that involves an extra moving part doesn't satisfy the use case of having like a safe fallback, right? If I have to have another process running with certs managed and like ingress and all these kind of extra moving pieces, that is probably then just as likely to break as my real IDP. Something like the one of the attractive things is this is simple and it's like not an external dependency at all. But I think maybe another way to address some of the concerns is be really strict about the scope of the local user support, and maybe go really far to make sure that nobody should be using this as a real IDP. And so maybe don't support groups, or maybe always hard code and say you can only use this for system : masters users. Like this functionality exists, but it's really specifically for this one use case. It's fine for a demo. It's fine as a fallback. But like we won't accept changes that make it more useful in a general sense, and then draw a line.
I think that's local user authenticator is, and it wouldn't be very hard to productionalize it. And it's already, it would be easy to set it up to run in the same deployment. So it's not a separate moving part. It's more almost like a sidecar. There's no ingress required because it's available as a Kubernetes service within that same deployment. And it's something that you can keep as a separate process with a separate code base and a separate configuration. And
we could, I did think about that. So productionalizing local user authenticator to me probably looks like making it automatically generate its own webhook token authenticator object and manage it. So when you install local user authenticator, it assumes that there's going to be a concierge already running, and it configures the concierge to respect it basically. And so that takes a bunch of the manual setup out of like connecting them then, right? So
yeah, we could even package it into the concierge deployment or into the supervisor deployment as a like optional add-on with like YTT, please give me the local user authenticator too, so I can have local users. Just work.
I don't see why we would do that though, versus just building it in, because I don't know if it's actually any different work, and it's also in the same code base, and it has all the same problems with growing without bounds if you are worried about that, right? Because we would still want it configurable with a CRD to be convenient to use. So like what you're left with is the same surface of work and the same sort of moving. Actually, there's an extra moving piece, but we're hiding it, which is cool. You know, that's nice. That's totally fine. I just don't know what you actually get out of that.
I also think maybe this decision is a little bit easier in the context of just the concierge, because the concierge is not even really trying to be a federation anything. All it's really configuring is token validation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of see the scope of features that the concierge will ever have for token validation pretty much matches like what Kubernetes has for token validation, which is JOTs, webhooks, and some simple bootstrappy kind of token. So that kind of like draws a box around what potential scope it might have. The supervisor, I think, is more open-ended because it has like proper IDP support, and maybe in the future would have a richer data model for like users and groups and refreshing and revocation and sessions and all the kinds of more complicated stuff. I don't know if any of that is as complicated on the concierge case.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, I'd always expected this to be like I had expected any local user style support to actually be only part of the supervisor and not part of the concierge. Like,
okay, actually, so yeah, I think on the concierge side, the kind of hack I mentioned, I don't know if it's a hack, the hack of like using JOT Authenticator to get a static user is actually pretty fine. I think the only feature that we would add there in the concierge is maybe a way to have a JOT authenticator that's restricted to a subset of users groups, because you maybe want to lock that down, but that would be fine. And then we could do some CLI stuff to make it a nice UX for a demo kind of case. On the supervisor, I think we would want to like do something a little bit more proper. And maybe having extra server there is not a bad idea. But then what we're talking about, I think, is like a standalone OIDC provider with usernames and passwords backed in secrets or something. But that brings along all the complexity. And I don't know what surface we would use to glue that thing into the supervisor. I think Ryan suggested LDAP too.
That's
maybe.
what the local user authenticator is, right? You can, it manages a set of secrets where each secret identifies the user's username, password, and list of groups. And so it has a controller watching those secrets, so you can dynamically create, edit, delete users. And then it conforms to the webhook style authenticator. So it can be set as an upstream in the supervisor as a webhook authenticator, or it could be used in the concierge as
what do you mean by the supervisor? The supervisor only has OIDC as upstream, right? Or am I forgetting something?
We could do webhook easily, right?
Yeah, we could do webhook. Webhook could be backed by the same kind of APIs on the front end that we're talking about for using username password auth to LDAP, basically. So it wouldn't be passing through the OIDC machinery, really. Wouldn't open a browser or anything. It would just accept your token on some API and validate it through the webhook. I think when I'm looking at like the local user authenticator, it just seems like a lot of code that would all go away and be replaced with not very much code in the concierge or the supervisor to do the same thing. Because we have a lot of machinery that's just kind of duplicated in both places.
So as a counter example to the UAA concern that Ryan had, so like when I was in OpenShift, we had an HT password IDP, which would literally give me like one blob of an HT password file, and I will treat each line as a user, right? So a user with their password hash, standard HT password format. That was very commonly used and deployed as a backup static IDP that did not have to go anywhere, and was commonly used in demo environments. It was commonly used in small instances, especially in the open source community, to just have a set of users. And it never grew beyond username and hash of password.
I think Dex is a pretty similar story. They have the static user thing in the config that I don't think has really changed much in the last couple of years. It's kind of like, I guess finished.
The one difference that OpenShift had from Dex is because groups were always local to OpenShift. You could configure groups as well. I don't know if people did. I just know that was available. So, but yeah, that is the upper bound of what I would want to support. Like, I don't think I would want an HT password file as input. Just it's kind of annoying. I think I kind of like what Moira was saying, that like we wouldn't actually let you pick the password at all. We would probably maybe make a different, like an API for like requesting. Like it could be as simple as you like make a user record and like sound like it's a request for a user record. So we might echo back a password the first time, and then that's it. If you don't know the if you don't get
I'd be fine doing that on the client side too, and just
yeah, you could do that.
best practices. It's not a so we could also consider local. Could also consider some local authentication method that is not using static passwords or tokens and is actually using some sort of key-based auth. Like we could, this could be our first experiment with U2F based login or something like that too. That would be interesting, I think, and useful for especially for the backup IDP case. If I could say like, oh, as a backup, I can always log in to this cluster with this U2F token if my IDP is down. And then for a business, like you can have some backup, you can have some backup tokens that maybe aren't even assigned to an individual user and are in a safe, right, as a backup way to log into a cluster. I don't know. Essentially, I think that the flow that we're replacing there is the flow that people do today in Kubernetes with admin certificates, but those are inconvenient because they expire and because the machinery that generates them is linked to the rest of the Kubernetes CA, and so you tie yourself into a lot of the dependency of how the lifecycle of the Kubernetes CA is managed. Okay. Okay, I don't think we're at consensus here. We are short on time. I think the rest of the items here we could get through pretty quick. Are folks okay moving on? Okay. We'll talk. I'm happy to talk more about this another time.
Could we start with Pablo's and then
Yep.
go to the one just above it if we have time?
I can go very quickly here. Just for some context, there was a document this team worked on internally, which was kind of a brainstorm about essentially opportunity areas and the outcomes that this team was thinking about driving with Pinniped as a project. I was thinking that as I think through the roadmap bits, I was wondering if the team would be comfortable actually posting that document almost as a lightweight way or kind of experiment to perhaps validate some of those areas, engage interest from the broader community about what the open source community would be interested in seeing happen with the project as some sort of proxy measurement for also helping figure out how we might also approach growing open source actual contributors, like converting stargazers into contributors. So I thought that might be kind of an interesting way. It's hard for us, I think, in some ways to be gauging that interest right now because the community is small. So I'm just trying to think of different ways we might do that. Because I know from an internal standpoint, from like a VMware standpoint, not to go too deep on that, merging these two different kind of roadmaps is always kind of tricky, balancing this game of the backer and the open source community. So I wanted to see how the team feels about publishing that.
I think that sounds good. I'd maybe be interested in going in there and cleaning it up.
Agreed.
A bit, but I think that sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll clean it up and then we'll get it up in the next week or so.
So I don't really have a strong opinion on this, but would this be a good thing to create as a new discussion topic in the GitHub discussion section of our repo?
I think that makes sense.
I don't actually know what we're supposed to use GitHub discussions for versus issues versus all the other methods, like the mailing list. Like, I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
have just
That sounds good to me. That we've kind of used the discussions feature for that in the past. Ryan kicked off like the original discussion there that was about kind of project milestones and roadmap. Okay, we are out of time. I'm going to just briefly mention this last item to get a temperature check. We have our container image that we ship right now has 3 binaries in it. It has the concierge binary, the supervisor binary, and the local user authenticator binary. They're each about like 50 megs. And most of that 50 megs is just like Kubernetes runtime, client Go machinery and stuff. I think we could save some space, like about half the space, if we were to build a single entry point that was called Pinniped server that had subcommands for each of those things. Does anybody object to that?
I do not object. I think that's totally cool and fine. The only thing I would ask is if we do that, can we please also just like better organize our code into like, these bits belong to the supervisor. These bits are shared. These bits belong to the concierge. Because right now it's like a flat tree of stuff and it bothers me. But I haven't gone in and started killing anything, mostly because I know I would cause a giant bunch of pain for everyone working on something.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that before, and we all agreed it's a good idea, but we need to pick a time to do it when nobody has any other big things in flight. So I'll file both of those things as issues, and I think that is time. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. If you are watching this recording at home, we hope you join us for the next community meeting, which is going to be the first Thursday of March on March 4th. Other than that, stay safe, stay warm, and we'll see you later. Bye.